Under the sunlight after the rain. Emily was once a vibrant girl, but a significant loss caused her to withdraw, living quietly in a small countryside village, as if the world had closed behind an old wooden gate. Days passed silently amidst a tranquil flower garden, where memories and pain intertwined, like morning mist covering each faded petal. When Lucas, a city photographer carrying his own burdens, unexpectedly appeared, he not only entered her living space, but also gradually touched the hidden corners of her soul. Without noise, without promises, only with patience, empathy, and sincerity, Lucas slowly opened a new world for Emily, where she no longer lived in the past, but began to believe in the present and the future. They were not perfect individuals, but it was their wounds that allowed them to see each other more completely. Their love story is a quiet, yet profound journey, a fateful encounter where two lost souls found light in each other and walked together toward peace under the sunlight after the rain. The small village where Emily lived resembled an old clock that had stopped ticking. Every sound was slow, each step echoing from a distant past. There, spring was unhurried, summer was not scorching, and sadness was ever present, seeping through every door crack. Every corner of the garden she visited daily. She did not avoid sorrow. Instead, she lived with it as a part of herself. Time seemed to have stopped with the moment her twin sister passed away, leaving an unfillable void. Emily was no longer the girl whose eyes sparkled with hope. Each day, she quietly tended to the flower beds in the garden, as if nurturing a part of her memories, a fragment of her remaining soul. The flowers bloomed and withered in succession, as if whispering the stories of the two sisters. She spoke little, interacted little, and seemed to demand nothing from life. All that remained in her was silence and the gentle breeze brushing through her loose hair. The villagers still held a reserved affection for her. They did not inquire much, nor did they try to pull her back into normal life. They let her live in her own world, where time was trapped between memory and reality. The children who once learned from Emily often ran past her gate, sometimes stopping to look in, then quietly leaving, as if sensing something too profound for their young minds to comprehend. At night, loneliness engulfed her most strongly. Emily often sat by the window, watching the distant flickering lights, occasionally writing a few lines in an old notebook, not to preserve, but as a way not to forget herself. The slanted, sometimes faint handwriting carried countless unnamed emotions. Some nights, she dreamed of her sister, standing beside the white chrysanthemum bushes, smiling and calling her name in a voice she had almost forgotten. Emily was not afraid of pain, only afraid it would disappear, because then she feared she would no longer be connected to her sister by any bond. Therefore, she kept that pain as a treasure. It prevented her from moving forward, but was also the only thing that made her feel she still had a reason to exist. Deep down, Emily understood that something inside her had shattered, and she had accepted living with those fragments as if they were an inseparable part of her soul. But what Emily did not know was that changes were quietly occurring. That autumn, as the leaves began to turn yellow, a new presence silently entered her life without knocking, without warning, just quietly, like a thin ray of sunlight after a long gray day. And even though she had not seen or felt it, her heart, which seemed to have cooled, was beginning to beat softly, like the first breeze touching the grass, like life quietly stirring from a small sprout beneath the cold soil. Lucas came to the small village not to find inspiration or pursue a new photo series as he usually did, but to escape. Escape from the glaring city lights, from whispers behind his back, from the weight of failure pressing against his chest every morning. Once regarded as a promising photographer, a name mentioned in exhibitions, a failed project had not only stripped him of recognition, but also of his faith in himself when life became suffocating. Lucas knew he had to leave, and he chose a place unfamiliar and quiet, where he believed no one would know his name. The house Lucas rented stood across from an old wooden cottage with a lush flower garden and moss-covered fences. At first, he paid little attention to who lived there, until one afternoon, just as the sun dipped below the hilltop, he saw a girl crouched, carefully picking fallen leaves from the flower beds. Sunlight touched her loose brown hair, draping her shoulders in a soft glow like mist. She was neither hurried nor hesitant. She simply existed as if she were a part of the garden itself, as if the wind, flowers, and soil had long grown accustomed to her quiet presence. Lucas didn't know why he stopped walking. He just stood there, watching her for a long while, realizing he was witnessing a kind of beauty that couldn't be captured by a camera. A beauty born from stillness and surrender. In that moment, his heart softened, as though all the city noise dissolved, leaving only the wind rustling through petals and the gentle rhythm of his own heartbeat. From that day forward, Lucas began to notice the house across the road. Every morning, when he drew his curtains, he would see the same girl later. He would learn her name was Emily, watering her plants quietly, or sitting in an old white-painted chair, reading a worn book. Not once did she look his way. She seemed unaware, or perhaps chose not to notice, that someone had begun watching her from across the street. He began photographing her garden from afar, through his window, with a long lens, not to spy, but to preserve the sense of peace it brought him. Each photo had a different mood, a misty morning cloaking the rose branches, a golden sunset bathing the grass, a silent moon hanging over bare tree limbs. But the image he cherished most was of Emily bowing her head, fingertips brushing a fallen petal. It wasn't sadness he captured, it was acceptance, a fragile, enduring grace. Lucas didn't try to approach Emily right away. He understood her silence wasn't a door that opened easily. But with each passing day, as he walked by her gate and caught even a fleeting glimpse of her face, he felt himself drawn closer to something unnameable. It wasn't love, not yet. It wasn't admiration. It was a longing to understand, to connect from one wounded soul to another, trying to live alongside their pain. And in that moment, standing beneath the tree, gazing toward Emily's garden, Lucas realized perhaps he had found the place he needed to be, not for fame, not to run away, but to begin something entirely new. From the heart, Emily's silence didn't discourage Lucas. On the contrary, it was like an invisible challenge that made him want to understand more about this girl who appeared in the garden with a quiet grace, yet whose eyes were always distant, as if searching for something lost. Whenever he saw her among the flower beds, Lucas tried to make small talk, a comment about the weather, or the early blooming daisies, but Emily would only nod, offer a faint smile, or quietly turn away. He wasn't disheartened. Deep down, Lucas understood that sometimes pain doesn't allow people to open up easily. One day, after a long night of rain, Lucas noticed the garden at Emily's house had many broken branches. He said nothing, simply brought his gloves, shears, and a basket of gardening tools and walked across the road. He didn't knock, just gently opened the gate and began cleaning up. When Emily noticed him, she stood at the porch watching, surprised, but she didn't stop him. She quietly let him continue, then turned and went inside without a word. For the first time, Lucas felt accepted, even if only in silence. From that day on, Lucas began leaving small things at her door, a sprig of lavender, a few ripe tangerines, or a tiny note with a line of spontaneous poetry. He never waited for a reply, never expected anything in return. It was his way of saying hello, quiet and patient, letting Emily know that someone was there, not forcing, not intruding, just simply present. One afternoon, as Lucas sat by his window, reviewing the week's photographs, he saw Emily standing at his gate, holding a small potted plant. She hesitated, clearly wrestling with something inside, then finally stepped forward and knocked gently. When Lucas opened the door, she said nothing, just handed him the plant and turned away. Without waiting for a question, he watched her figure disappear behind the flowers, feeling as if something fragile had just been placed into his hands. Not the plant, but a sign, a very quiet beginning. From then on, the atmosphere between them slowly changed. Their wordless encounters were now replaced by gentle nods, and sometimes a greeting. On some days, Lucas would see Emily reading on the porch, and he would raise his hand in a soft wave. She would respond with a faint, warm smile. There was still distance between them, many unspoken things, but the repetition of small acts each day gradually created a familiar rhythm, like a wordless melody that played every morning in the silent garden. Lucas wasn't in a hurry. He understood that those who have been broken don't easily give their trust again. But he also knew that with enough patience and gentleness, the door would eventually open, not by a loud knock, but by a cool breeze, so soft you could hardly feel it, yet strong enough to stir a soul. That afternoon's rain wasn't heavy, but it was persistent and chilling. Lucas, returning from town, suddenly paused when he saw Emily standing under her porch, eyes quietly fixed on the garden as usual. The small awning wasn't enough to shield her from the wind, yet she didn't seem to want to go inside. As he walked closer, ready to greet her, Emily unexpectedly turned and softly said, "Come in and stay out of the rain." Her voice was so low it almost disappeared into the falling rain. But to Lucas, it was as clear as a door opening for the first time. He stepped in, shoulders slightly damp. Emily went to the kitchen, poured 2 cups of hot tea, and returned to sit across from him at a modest wooden table near the window. They sat in silence for a long while. No greetings, no polite questions, only the sound of rain and the gentle aroma of tea. Lucas felt no need to speak. He understood that his presence alone today was enough for Emily. When Emily began to speak, her voice was low and steady, like she was reading aloud from a familiar journal. She didn't cry, but her eyes glistened with a soft mist of sorrow. She talked about her twin sister, about the accident that took her, and the emptiness left behind when the person closest to her disappeared in an instant. She wasn't just my sister, she was a part of me. When she died, it felt like half of my soul went with her. Lucas listened, never interrupting. Emily's words weren't meant for comfort. They were meant to be understood. When she finished, he simply nodded, then shared a story of his own about an exhibition he'd poured a year into, only for it to be canceled at the last minute. No one blamed him, but he knew he had failed. It felt like screaming in the middle of a desert. and no one could hear. They sat quietly again, letting their wounds settle. There was no need for hollow reassurances, only a space, quiet enough for pain to be acknowledged and allowed to rest. Emily turned to him, and for the first time, her eyes did not look away. "You don't have to do anything," she said. "Just be here." That moment wasn't a promise, nor the beginning of a defined relationship. It was simply two people, each carrying a different kind of hurt, realizing they weren't alone. In the frozen world Emily had lived in for so long, a crack had appeared, not big, not loud, but just wide enough for the light to find its way in. The rain that night came without warning, as if the sky itself sensed something delicate, stirring between two souls who thought they had found harmony. After slowly beginning to open her heart, Emily started to feel alive again, but that very sensation frightened her. Something inside her wasn't ready to accept happiness yet, like someone who had lived too long in darkness, now squinting painfully at the light. That day, while walking past the village market, an older woman, an old friend of her mother, casually mentioned her twin sister. She didn't mean harm, it was just a wistful remark. If your sister were still alive, you two would probably be settling down by now. That innocent comment sliced through Emily's healing like a knife reopening a barely healed wound. She froze, and in that brief moment, everything she had quietly built with Lucas seemed to tremble beneath the surge of grief rising from within. That evening, Emily didn't come out to her porch as usual. Lucas watched from across the street, feeling a strange emptiness in the air. No light turned on in the familiar window. No figure moved through the garden. The next day came, and then another, but still no sign of her. Lucas left brief notes at her gate, but none were answered. A quiet worry began to seep through his chest, a mix of confusion and helplessness. Meanwhile, Emily had retreated into her sister's old room, a space she hadn't dared enter in a long time. Everything remained untouched. The scarf her sister once wore, the notebook with her gentle, slanting handwriting. Emily picked up each item as though trying to piece herself back together. Her fear became clear. She was terrified of losing again. If she allowed herself to love Lucas, to believe in some possible future, she might lose it too. And this time, she wasn't sure she could survive the fall. She withdrew, not because she didn't feel anything for Lucas, but because what she felt was too real. It made her feel vulnerable, like something beyond her control was stirring. She hadn't yet learned how to love without fearing the inevitable loss. She didn't want Lucas to step into a part of her life she wasn't ready to fully share. Lucas, though he didn't understand everything, didn't blame her. What he felt was not resentment, but a deep ache, knowing the woman he cared for was wrestling with pain. Even she hadn't fully unraveled. He knew he couldn't fix anything just by being there, and he certainly couldn't demand entry into a place that had been closed for so long. But he also knew that walking away now would mean leaving Emily alone in the storm she was trying to weather. So he stayed with quiet patience, unwavering and steady, like the sun always waiting behind the thickest of clouds. In the days following the rain, the weather quietly shifted, the skies cleared, and the gray clouds that had lingered for weeks began to drift away, giving way to soft sunlight filtering through the leaves. As always, Lucas left a short letter in Emily's mailbox each morning. No elaborate words, no grand gestures, just a few lines of reflection. Sometimes a simple wish for a peaceful day, sometimes a small story from his own life. It was his way of offering a bit of light, something gentle and human. Emily never replied, but she read every word carefully, slowly, as if reading her own heart through someone else's voice. Each letter felt like a silent note resonating within her, breaking through the stillness of her soul. Gradually, she began to look forward to them, not because of the words themselves, but because they reminded her that someone was patiently waiting, caring, without asking for anything in return. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like a burden. She didn't have to pretend to be okay. One clear morning, with just enough sun to warm her shoulders, Emily stepped out of the house. She stood before the gate for a long time, fingers brushing the worn edges of the old wooden mailbox. Lucas, watering his plants as usual, paused when he saw her. Their eyes met. She smiled, not a perfect smile, not bright or wide, but one that carried a quiet warmth, enough to brighten his entire day. She didn't speak. She simply walked over, took a folded piece of paper from her pocket, and placed it gently in his hand before turning to leave. Lucas opened it. Inside was a single line. "Thank you for not walking away." That moment needed no more words. The walls Emily had built around her heart had started to crack, not because of anything grand, but because someone had simply stayed. Lucas didn't press, didn't rush. He just remained a steady presence, like sunlight that wasn't blinding, but always there, quietly helping the flowers bloom and a heart begin to open. Every morning, Emily would open her small flower shop tucked beside the village road. Once overgrown with wild grass and forgotten dreams, she arranged the first bouquets of the day carnations, lavender, and chamomile carefully on the porch, occasionally pausing to admire the petals swaying in the breeze. Her hands no longer trembled as they once did, and the sadness in her eyes had softened. In every gesture, there was a quiet beginning, a deep and calm flow, like a clear lake emerging after a long rain. Lucas didn't need to do much. He simply stood beside her, silently, helping organize the shelves, watering the hanging pots. On some mornings, he brought a warm cup of coffee. Other times, it was just a slice of buttered bread to share under the eaves. They didn't talk much, but every glance exchanged was a story, a promise unspoken. Lucas knew he wasn't there to change Emily's past, but to help her rewrite the present, starting with the smallest things, the garden behind the house, once Emily's private sanctuary, was now open again. Together, they planted anew, turned the soil, replaced old pots with fresh sprouts. Each time a flower bloomed, Emily felt herself reborn along with it. And when the village children came running, asking for flowers to bring home to their mothers, she no longer hid behind the curtains. Instead, she smiled and knelt to help them choose the prettiest blooms. Even the villagers noticed the change. They didn't say much, but their eyes, when they looked at Emily, were different now. No longer pitying, now quietly respectful. They saw a girl who once carried heavy sorrow, now standing tall and continuing forward, not flamboyant, not radiant, but resilient and calm, like the earth that raised her. One late autumn afternoon, golden sunlight spilling over the old tiled roof, Emily and Lucas sat together beneath the Bodhi tree in the front yard. She leaned gently on his shoulder, saying nothing. The birds chirped softly. The scent of flowers drifted on the breeze. Everything was quietly beautiful. And in that moment, they both knew they had weathered the storm, and now they were here. What they found wasn't just love, it was companionship, a hand warm enough to hold when the heart turns cold. That was the day Emily looked up at the sky and realized for the first time in a long while she was no longer afraid of the sunlight, because beside her now was someone who would always be there like sunlight after the rain, not blinding, but warm enough to stir life back into her soul. Life was no longer a string of repetitive, shadowed days. It had become a series of moments, fully lived and deeply felt. Emily no longer walked the village paths with vacant eyes. Every step she took now held the calm assurance of someone who had chosen to stand up again. She hadn't forgotten the past, but she had learned to let it gently fall behind her, no longer as a burden, but as a tender memory. Lucas continued his work as a photographer, but not for acclaim or success. Now, he captured simplicity, a child's smile in the flower garden, dew on a freshly bloomed petal, or the quiet, peaceful gaze of the woman beside him. He had come to understand that the most valuable things in life weren't what the lens could seize, but the true emotions stirred by ordinary scenes. The little house in the village had transformed from a shelter into a home. Mornings began with the aroma of tea and gentle laughter on the porch. Afternoons ended with slow walks through the garden, where flowers continued to bloom despite the approaching winter. And at night, under the soft glow of warm lights shining through the window, Emily and Lucas shared fragments of their day like soulmates, like two wandering hearts that had finally found each other. Under the sunlight after the rain, they didn't find anything miraculous, only each other at the right time, in the right way, and with enough tenderness to journey together through every season of life. It wasn't the ending of a love story, but the beginning of a life lived truthfully, loved deeply, and healed gently through the quiet, unconditional presence of one another. Thank you for being here. If this story touched you, leave a comment or share it with someone who might need it. Subscribe for more healing stories like this.